In the federal prison system of the United States, isolation is not an abstract concept. It is a regulated condition, formally documented, measured in hours and enforced through architecture. At facilities like United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, individuals assigned to restrictive housing units can spend up to 23 hours a day inside a cell of this size. The dimensions are not speculative. Federal Bureau of Prisons records and oversight reports consistently describe cells in high-security units as confined, minimally furnished, and designed for control rather than comfort. The door does not open freely. Movement is scheduled. Contact is limited. Sound behaves differently here. Concrete absorbs and reflects noise in uneven ways. Footsteps echo through corridors, but voices rarely carry clearly. Communication between cells, where it occurs, is often indirect. Tapping on walls, brief exchanges through vents, or shouted fragments during movement periods. These forms of communication have been documented in prison studies and testimonies collected by oversight bodies and legal filings. There is no natural darkness. Artificial lighting is controlled externally. In many restrictive housing units, lights remain on continuously, dimmed but never fully off. This practice, cited in multiple correctional reports and litigation records, is intended for supervision and security. But it also alters circadian rhythms. Sleep becomes fragmented. Time becomes less distinct. The structure of the day is defined by institutional schedule, not personal choice. Meals arrive through the slot in the door. There is no communal dining in this setting. Food service is timed, standardized, and recorded. According to Bureau of Prisons procedures, inmates in segregation receive the same nutritional standards as the general population, but the method of delivery reinforces separation. The tray enters. The tray leaves. There is no conversation attached to either action. If you find value in carefully documented accounts like this, consider subscribing to follow the full record as it unfolds. The physical design of Leavenworth reflects its age. Opened in 1903, it is the oldest federal penitentiary in continuous operation in the United States. Its original construction emphasized durability and surveillance, long before modern correctional design principles emerged. Over time, sections have been modified, but much of the structure retains characteristics of early 20th century penal architecture. Thick masonry. Narrow corridors. Limited external visibility. From inside a restrictive housing cell, the outside environment is almost entirely abstract. Windows, where present, are often narrow and positioned to restrict view. Some cells rely entirely on internal lighting, with no direct exposure to daylight. These conditions are not uniform across all units, but documented inspections have repeatedly noted limited natural light in older high-security facilities. The absence of visual change contributes to a documented phenomenon: temporal disorientation. In multiple academic studies and legal testimonies, individuals held in prolonged isolation describe difficulty tracking time without external cues. Days begin to resemble each other with minimal variation. Routine exists, but it does not necessarily anchor perception. Wait again. Recreation, when permitted, typically involves a brief period outside the cell, often in a controlled enclosure. These enclosures are commonly described in official reports as secure, high-walled spaces, sometimes referred to as recreation cages. Access is scheduled and subject to institutional discretion, staffing, and security classification. The duration is limited. The environment is controlled. Return to the cell follows. There is no uncertainty about authority here. The structure itself communicates it. Every surface is fixed. Every object is accounted for. Even posture becomes regulated over time. Observational reports from correctional oversight bodies note that individuals in long-term restrictive housing often adapt their movement patterns to confined spaces. Steps shorten. Gestures become minimal. Energy is conserved. Not as a strategy. As a consequence. The psychological effects of extended isolation have been studied extensively. Research cited in court cases and correctional reviews identifies a range of documented outcomes: anxiety, difficulty concentrating, sensitivity to stimuli, and in some cases, cognitive disruption. These findings are not theoretical. They are drawn from clinical evaluations, sworn testimony, and longitudinal observation. The system acknowledges some of these risks. Policies have evolved in response to legal challenges and advocacy. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has issued guidelines intended to regulate the use and duration of restrictive housing. Oversight mechanisms exist, including internal reviews and external audits. But implementation varies. Conditions depend on classification, facility resources, and administrative decisions. Inside the cell, policy is not visible. Only routine is. Paperwork exists, requests, grievances, official forms. Access to these processes is documented, but response times and outcomes are not uniform. Legal filings over the years have highlighted both the existence of these channels and the challenges in navigating them from within restrictive housing. Communication with the outside world is also regulated. Mail is screened. Phone access, where permitted, is limited and scheduled. Visits, if allowed, are controlled and often non-contact. Each layer reinforces separation. Not temporary but sustained. Halfway through this account, the environment has not changed. The walls remain the same. The light remains constant. If you want to continue examining how these systems operate in detail, you can subscribe and follow the next segment as it develops. There are no dramatic shifts in this setting. No sudden escalation. The intensity comes from repetition. From the absence of variation. From the consistency of control. At Leavenworth, as in other high-security federal institutions, restrictive housing is not an exception to the system. It is part of its design. Documented. Regulated. Enforced. And for those assigned to it, experienced in measured hours that accumulate without visible markers. The door stays closed. The light does not turn off. And time, as recorded on official logs, continues forward, whether it is perceived that way inside the cell or not. Inside United States Penitentiary Leavenworth, routine is not simply a schedule. It is a system of regulation that defines movement, interaction, and time itself. The day begins without variation. There is no alarm clock in the conventional sense. Wakefulness is influenced by institutional lighting and the anticipated timing of the first count. In federal facilities, official counts are conducted multiple times a day. These counts are mandatory, recorded events, requiring each individual to be physically present and accounted for within their assigned space. In restrictive housing, this means remaining in position. So, visible through the door window. The process is procedural. Officers move along the corridor, verifying occupancy cell by cell. Documentation follows each round. This system is outlined in Bureau of Prisons operational policies and reinforced through internal audits. It is repeated daily. Without exception. Movement outside the cell, when authorized, follows a controlled sequence. The door opens only after clearance is given. Hands are typically secured before exit. Escort procedures are standardized, designed to minimize unpredictability. These protocols are not unique to Leavenworth, but are applied consistently across high-security federal institutions. Distance is maintained. Contact is minimized. Each step is directed. The architecture supports this process. Corridors are linear. Sight lines are unobstructed. Doors are reinforced steel, electronically controlled or manually secured depending on the unit. These features are not incidental. They reflect a design priority centered on supervision and containment. Even routine actions, showers, medical visits, recreation, are scheduled and monitored individually in restrictive housing. There is no group movement in this setting. Each transition requires coordination between staff, confirmation of availability, and adherence to protocol. Time is segmented. Not by personal choice, but by institutional allocation. Meals continue to arrive through the slot. The process does not change from day to day. According to federal standards, meals are nutritionally regulated and prepared under supervision. Delivery, however, reinforces isolation. There is no dining hall here. No shared table. Only the brief sound of metal against metal as the tray passes through the opening. If you're following this examination of daily structure inside federal custody, consider subscribing to continue through the remaining segments as they are documented. Cleaning is part of the routine. Individuals are responsible for maintaining their assigned space within the limitations of available supplies. Cleaning materials are distributed according to schedule and policy. Inspections occur periodically, recorded by staff. Compliance is expected. Deviation is noted. Documentation is constant. Paper records, electronic logs, incident reports, all form part of the administrative layer that runs parallel to physical confinement. These records track behavior, movement, requests, and disciplinary actions. They are reviewed internally and, in some cases, externally through oversight mechanisms. The system produces a continuous record. Every day contributes to it. Interaction with staff is functional and limited. Communication is typically directive. Instructions, confirmations, procedural exchanges. Extended conversation is not part of standard operation in restrictive housing. This dynamic has been described in correctional studies and staff training materials. The relationship is defined by role, not by dialogue. Access to programs is restricted in this environment. Educational, vocational, and rehabilitative activities that may be available in the general population are often limited or absent in segregation units. This has been noted in federal reports and litigation concerning conditions of confinement. Time, in this context, is not structured around progress, but around completion of assigned intervals. Days are counted, not developed. Religious practice, where documented, is typically conducted individually. Access to chaplaincy services may be provided through scheduled visits or written correspondence, depending on facility conditions and classification. Group services are generally not part of restrictive housing operations. Adaptation occurs within these limits. Quietly. Incrementally. Requests for services, medical, legal, administrative, are submitted through formal channels. Forms are filled out, passed through staff and processed according to procedure. Delays are documented in some cases, particularly in legal filings and oversight reviews. The system acknowledges the request. Response follows its own timeline. From the corridor, the pattern is consistent. Doors remain closed. Movement is sequential. Sound is controlled. Halfway through the day, there is no visible change in environment. The lighting remains constant. The architecture does not shift. The only variation is procedural, count times, meal delivery, scheduled movements. This consistency is not incidental. It is operational. If you want to continue examining how institutional routine shapes long-term confinement, you can subscribe and follow the next segment as it is released. As evening approaches, the structure remains intact. There is no transition in atmosphere. No indication of closure beyond the continuation of count procedures and reduced movement. Lights remain on as required for supervision. Sleep, when it comes, occurs under the same conditions as the rest of the day. Illumination, containment, observation. The routine does not end. It cycles, documented in logs, enforced through design, and repeated, with minimal variation, across days that are measured not by events, but by adherence to a system that does not pause. Contact with the outside world inside United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth is structured, regulated, and limited by design. It is not absent, but it is controlled at every stage. For individuals in restrictive housing, communication does not occur freely. It follows procedures outlined by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, shaped by security classification, facility resources, and institutional policy. Visits, where permitted, are not direct. Physical contact is typically prohibited. The barrier is literal. Glass separates both sides. Interaction is conducted through a telephone handset, mounted on either wall. Speech travels electronically, not through open space. This arrangement is standard across many high-security units, documented in federal visitation guidelines and facility reports. The structure defines the exchange. Time is limited. Duration is scheduled in advance, subject to approval and availability. Visits can be reduced, postponed, or canceled based on institutional conditions. Lockdowns, staffing shortages, or administrative decisions can alter access without notice. These interruptions have been recorded in oversight reviews and inmate filings. The expectation is consistency. The reality is conditional. Mail remains one of the primary forms of communication. Letters enter and leave the institution through a screening process. According to federal policy, incoming and outgoing correspondence is subject to inspection for contraband and security concerns. This includes reading and, in some cases, copying written content. Privacy is limited. Content is monitored. Delays are not uncommon. Processing time depends on volume, staffing, and procedural requirements. Legal correspondence is handled under separate guidelines with protections in place, but still subject to verification protocols. The letter arrives, but not immediately. Telephone access, where authorized, is also restricted. Calls are scheduled, time-limited, and monitored. The Bureau of Prisons operates a system that records and tracks most non-legal calls. This is standard practice, acknowledged in official policy and disclosed to those using the service. Each call is logged. Duration is fixed. Disconnection is automatic when time expires. For individuals in restrictive housing, access to phones is often less frequent than in the general population. Availability depends on unit policy and security considerations. In some cases, requests must be submitted in advance. Approval is required. Access is not guaranteed. If you are following this documented examination of communication inside federal custody, consider subscribing to continue as further conditions are presented in sequence. Beyond direct contact, information flow is also controlled. News, where available, is limited to approved sources. Access to television, radio, or printed materials depends on unit regulations and classification. In restrictive housing, these options may be reduced or absent altogether. Federal reports and legal challenges have noted variability in access across facilities and units. Information enters slowly and selectively. This controlled environment affects not only communication but perception. Events outside continue, uninterrupted. But inside, awareness of those events depends on institutional channels. There is no immediate connection, only delayed transmission. Interaction between individuals within the facility is similarly restricted. In general population units, movement and limited association may occur under supervision. In restrictive housing, separation is enforced. There are no shared spaces, no group activities, no informal exchanges. The structure prevents proximity. Even incidental contact is minimized. This level of separation has been a subject of legal and academic scrutiny. Court cases and research studies have examined the impact of reduced social interaction on individuals in long-term segregation. Findings consistently point to measurable psychological effects, though the extent varies by duration and individual factors. The system recognizes some of these concerns. Policies have been adjusted over time, but the fundamental structure remains. Separation is a core component. Requests for increased contact, whether through additional phone time, visitation, or program access, are processed through formal channels. Outcomes depend on classification reviews, behavioral records, and administrative discretion. Documentation exists, but results are not uniform. Each request enters the system. Each response follows procedure. From within the visitation booth, the barrier does not change. The glass remains. The handset remains. The distance is fixed. Halfway through this process, the exchange continues under observation. Staff presence is constant, positioned to monitor compliance and ensure security. This oversight is standard and documented in operational procedures. There is no privacy in the conventional sense, only regulated interaction. If you want to continue examining how separation influences long-term confinement and adaptation, you can subscribe and follow the next segment as it is developed. When the visit ends, it ends without extension. The line disconnects. The door opens on one side. Movement resumes under escort. There is no lingering, no unsupervised moment. The structure closes the interaction as precisely as it began. Back inside the cell, the conditions are unchanged. The same walls, the same light, the same controlled environment. Outside communication has occurred, but the separation remains intact, documented, maintained, and repeated, according to a system where contact exists, but only within limits that do not alter the underlying condition of confinement. Inside United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, confinement is not determined solely by physical space. It is structured through classification. Every individual in federal custody is assigned a security level, a custody designation, and a housing status. These classifications are not informal. They are calculated using standardized criteria established by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, documented in policy manuals and applied across institutions. The process begins with a record: criminal history, sentence length, institutional behavior, history of violence or escape. Each factor contributes to a numerical score. That score influences placement. Placement determines conditions. At Leavenworth, a high-security penitentiary, individuals are typically classified at the upper levels of this system. The facility is designed to house those considered to require the highest degree of control within the federal prison structure. This designation is not arbitrary. It reflects both the nature of offenses and the assessment of institutional risk. Classification is reviewed periodically, but not continuously. Changes require process, documentation, approval. Within this framework, restrictive housing is not assigned at random. It is used for specific administrative or disciplinary purposes. Federal policy distinguishes between these categories, though the physical conditions may be similar. Administrative detention can be applied for investigation, protection, or pending transfer. Disciplinary segregation follows a formal finding of rule violation. Both are recorded. Both are subject to review. But duration can vary. The decision to place an individual in restrictive housing is documented through incident reports, hearing records, and administrative forms. These records are maintained within the institution and, in some cases, reviewed through internal oversight or external legal processes. The system produces a paper trail. Each step is recorded, but the experience remains the same from inside the cell. The classification system extends beyond housing. It governs access, programs, movement, communication. Even the timing of routine actions can be influenced by classification level. Higher security designation typically results in greater restriction, fewer privileges, more controlled movement. This structure is consistent with federal correctional policy and has been examined in multiple government reports and academic studies. If you are following this documented breakdown of institutional control, consider subscribing to continue as the system is examined in further detail. Interaction with classification staff occurs through scheduled reviews. These are formal meetings, often brief, conducted in controlled settings. The purpose is to assess status, review behavior, and determine whether adjustments are warranted. The format is standardized. Questions are procedural. Responses are recorded. There is no negotiation in the conventional sense. Only evaluation. Recommendations from these reviews move through administrative channels. Final decisions may involve multiple levels of approval, depending on the nature of the change. This layered process is designed to maintain consistency and oversight, but it also introduces delay. Time passes between request and outcome, sometimes without visible change. Behavior within the institution is continuously monitored and documented. Incident reports, compliance records, and staff observations contribute to an ongoing profile. This profile influences future classification decisions. The system accumulates data, day by day. Each entry carries weight. Positive behavior may support requests for reduced restriction or transfer. Negative incidents can reinforce existing classification or result in further limitation. The criteria are defined. Application can vary. Legal challenges over the years have questioned aspects of classification and segregation practices within the federal system. Court records show ongoing examination of due process, duration of confinement, and conditions of restrictive housing. Some rulings have led to policy adjustments, including increased review requirements and revised guidelines. The system evolves, but gradually, within established boundaries. Halfway through this process, the administrative layer remains active, even when nothing changes physically inside the cell. Files are updated. Reviews are scheduled. Decisions are pending. The individual remains in place. The classification remains in effect. If you want to continue examining how these decisions impact long-term confinement and potential transition, you can subscribe and follow the next segment as it unfolds. Transfer between facilities is one possible outcome of classification review. Movement from a high-security penitentiary like Leavenworth to a lower-security institution depends on multiple factors: time served, behavior, and reassessment of risk. The process is structured, not immediate. Approval must be granted. Logistics must align. Until then, the current conditions remain. The classification system does not operate in isolation. It interacts with every other aspect of confinement: routine, communication, access, and environment. It defines the boundaries, sets the limits, determines the range of possible change. From within the institution, these decisions are not visible in real time. There is no direct access to the full process. Only notifications when they arrive. A status updated. A request denied. A review scheduled. The documentation continues. The system processes information. And the individual remains within a structure where control is not only enforced through walls and doors, but through a continuous administrative mechanism that defines where they are placed, how they move, and what conditions they experience, day after day, within a framework that records everything, but reveals little in the moment it is lived. Inside United States Penitentiary Leavenworth, the passage of time is recorded, but not always experienced in a conventional way. Days are logged. Counts are completed. Schedules are followed. But the environment remains constant. There are no visible markers of transition between one day and the next. The same walls, the same lighting, the same sequence of controlled actions. Documentation confirms movement through time, but the physical setting offers little to distinguish one period from another. In federal custody, sentences are measured in months and years. That measurement is precise. It is calculated from court records, adjusted for time served, and monitored through institutional systems managed by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Release dates are defined, projected, subject to review. But the experience of reaching those dates is shaped by repetition. Routine does not accelerate. It does not pause. It continues at a fixed pace regardless of perception. Within restrictive housing, this continuity is uninterrupted. The conditions described in earlier segments, limited movement, controlled communication, structured routine, do not resolve on their own. They persist until a formal change occurs: reclassification, transfer, or completion of a designated period. Each of these outcomes depends on process, documentation, approval. Until then, the structure remains intact. If you've followed this documented examination from the beginning, consider subscribing to continue exploring other real-world systems of confinement presented with the same level of verified detail. There is no single moment that defines the experience, no clear turning point. Instead, there is accumulation. Days repeating with minimal variation. Records building over time. The institution continues to function according to policy. Staff rotate through shifts. Logs are updated. Procedures are carried out. These operations are consistent, recorded, and subject to oversight through internal review and, in some cases, external inspection. The system remains active, even when nothing appears to change. For individuals held within it, adaptation becomes part of daily existence. Studies and documented testimonies describe adjustments to routine, to environment, to limitation. These adaptations are not uniform, but they are observed across multiple accounts. Behavior aligns with structure. Movement reflects space. Expectations adjust to what is available. The long-term consequences of confinement, particularly in restrictive conditions, have been examined through research, legal challenges, and policy review. Findings vary, but the presence of sustained impact is consistently documented. Cognitive strain. Altered perception of time. Difficulty readjusting to less restrictive environments. These outcomes are not universal, but they are recorded, and they are part of the broader discussion surrounding incarceration policy in the United States. Halfway through the night, the environment inside the cell remains unchanged. The light continues to emit a steady, artificial glow. There is no full darkness. No signal that the day has ended beyond the continuation of schedule. Sleep, when it occurs, happens within these conditions. Interrupted. Measured. Resumed. The structure does not disengage. It maintains continuity. If you want to see more factual, carefully documented examinations of institutions like this, you can subscribe and follow as additional segments are released. Eventually, every sentence reaches a defined endpoint: release, transfer, or transition to another form of custody. These outcomes are documented in official records, processed through administrative systems, and carried out according to procedure. But within the cell, those endpoints are not visible in advance. Only the present conditions are. The same walls, the same light, the same controlled environment. Time moves forward in records, in files, in official counts. Inside, it is experienced through repetition, measured not by change but by continuation. And as the institution remains active, documenting, regulating, and maintaining control, the experience of confinement persists in the same form, without resolution, within a system designed not to conclude on its own, but to continue until an external decision brings it to an end.